973 is off at the 6 right access road. Thank you.
473, thank you.
Star 7084, nice to be done. Exit left on Juliet, taxi into FedEx, go directly to apron 12227.
Directly to FedEx for 292, good morning, sir. 704, connect.
Jazz 540, Charles Tower, wind 35011, gusting 16 knots. Traffic front, no conflict, you'll be off momentarily. Cleared line runway 33 left.
Clear line 33 left, so Jazz 540.
Jazz 540, exit Fox 4, make the hard right turn south on Foxtrot. Contact ground 121.65.
Okay, Fox 4 on the Foxtrot and over to ground on 2165. Jazz 540 ground, taxi Foxtrot, November, cross runway 2 right, turn right Bravo, and then left at Alpha Kilo. Jazz 540 be next left rather, November, in a cross runway 33 right, and then Bravo, Alpha Kilo. Affirmative.
Your flight is westbound, so appropriate for direction of flight would be flight level 320. Would you like that?
Yeah, we can fly level 320, 17976.
And then 7976, flying flight level 320.
Up to flight level 320, 17976.
Welcome, VOR navigation. Welcome to the stream, everyone. How y'all doing? So for tonight, I'm going to go over some VOR stuff. VOR is one of the more tricky topics in the book. Tricky topic on the private pilot written test, so that's why I wanted to kind of touch on it. It can be one where you really have to commit some time to think about, so I figured let's do a night of just VOR. Welcome to the airplane. Here's me and Dave over here hanging out. Feel free to leave your highs and hellos in the chat. We got the chat over there. Yeah, so VOR stuff. That's the topic of tonight, and I think it's one where, yeah, I think it's one where the sometimes people can get discouraged because there's a lot of info. So I want to look at kind of start with why is it useful, what is it, and get into how you would read it. There's a couple different modes that we're able to use the VOR for, and that sort of thing. So yeah, let's hop right into it. So, what's a VOR? Well, it's this thing. A VOR is a it's a ground-based navigation system, right? So this is a VOR. This is actually Wyerton's VOR, YVV. Here, and so it's operated by Nav Canada. You can see the Nav Canada truck there, and this is it. It's a lot bigger building in person versus what it looks like if you see one whiz by when you fly over it or that sort of thing. So the VOR, yeah, one of the last VORs. Hey Tyler, one of the last VORs that's ever going to exist. Because Nav Canada, or is it Transport that put it? I guess Nav Canada would have been the ones. They put out a big list of these are all the VORs, and we're going to take all these ones out of service at some point. This is one that I think is going to stick around for a little bit longer than a lot of the other ones, just because Wyerton tends to be on the main flight path into Pearson. But it's definitely an outdated technology in the grand scheme of things now that GPS is so common. But there's some merit to it, and we'll get to it in a minute. Why you should learn some of the VOR stuff. So let's talk about VOR for a little bit. Some of the basics. So this was. Like I say, it was before GPS, and it was very widely used, and so evidence of that is we have one locally, right? It'd be kind of weird to have such local representation. There's VORs scattered all across the country, all across Canada and the States as well. So the like Dave was saying, VHF omnidirectional range is what it stands for. And it's ground-based, and this is the frequency range, and it happens to be just below what the airplane comm radio, the communication radio frequency range is. If you have an airplane that has a comm radio and mixed in with it is a nav radio in the same device, it would be the nav side of the radio, and it's likely even labeled nav right on it there. But hang on a minute. I thought you just said that this is an outdated technology that they're chopping. And why are we talking about the VOR? How does this apply to me when we have like modern GPS receivers and Garmin G5 HSI stuff, and how does this all fit in? Well, the VOR is still there right now, so that's a potential reason. But the other thing is, when you're using some of these more modern tools, like in this case in FWQ here, we have a certified GPS built in to the airplane. Or even if you think, well, I don't need to worry about that. I got my iPad and ForeFlight, and I'm a VFR pilot, and I don't need to know this IFR, GPS, IFR, VOR stuff. Why would I need that? I got my iPad and ForeFlight. Well, let me tell you, if you were to decide, hey, I really like ForeFlight and I really like all the cool features that it does to improve my safety as a pilot, maybe you would decide to upgrade ForeFlight to the Pro package. And in the Pro package, you have this synthetic vision display. And with the synthetic vision display, let me just get a route going here. Let's say I'm going to go to somewhere. On the synthetic vision display, check it out at the bottom. Looks kind of like the VOR indicator. It's a slightly different indicator, but it's very, very similar to what we're going to be talking about tonight. And if you know how to read the VOR indicator and you know all the theory on how to read VOR, then it's going to be much easier to transition into this, and the principles of this will make sense, because it's the same principles. It's just implemented a little bit different. So that's the plan here tonight. We're gonna get into the VOR stuff. Okay, so some other things you got to know about VOR. Because it's ground based, it needs line of sight. And what does that mean? Do you have to see the VOR? No. The VOR radio signal can travel for hundreds of miles, but there can't be anything between your airplane and where the ground station is. So if you're navigating in the mountains and there's a mountain between you and the VOR you're navigating to, sad day for you, you can't use that VOR. This is also true for our airplane communication radios. It's also true for GPS, oddly enough. If you're really down low in a mountain valley where it can't get enough satellites because the mountain walls on both sides are too high to see enough satellites, GPS would also have a problem. But you're more likely to get GPS than you would, one single VOR that's on the other side of a mountain. So that's really important. Another thing is it's based on magnetic bearings. Most GPS-based systems would do distances, right? So I'm a mile off course, I'm 2 miles off course. VOR is all based on angles. And that's really the key difference on how you would operate a VOR. Other than that, the indicator's pretty much the same. Hey, Michelle, how's it going? So, how do we use all this stuff? Well, the Nav Canada manages all the equipment on the ground. We just got to manage the equipment inside the aircraft. So you're going to have an antenna, you're going to have the receiver, and you're going to have an indicator. So the antenna on the top of the tail here, it'll be this V-type antenna. It doesn't have to be on the top of the tail, but that's a common place for it. The V-type antenna is the one that you're looking for. That's just, it's the VOR antenna. It also does some other systems like ILS and that sort of thing. So need to have an antenna, good antenna. If one of these sides of the antenna is broken off, you're not going to get a very good signal, for example. The receiver, that's what's inside the cockpit. That's actually going to plug into the antenna. We've got 2 VOR receivers actually in this airplane, FWQ. So you got this part of the radio here is the nav part of the radio, so that could tune to a VOR, and it's not using the GPS for that. It is actually tuning to it. And then we have another receiver down here that's just dedicated for just VOR and ILS and that sort of thing. So that's the receiver. And then you've got the indicator. So this is what you're really going to interact with for the most part to actually get readings and figure out bearings and stuff like that. A bunch of different parts of the indicator, kind of a noisy picture there, lots going on. So let's break it down a little bit. One of the important things, and especially when it comes down to written test questions, is going to be the number at the top. Here it's saying the course index. Basically, the number at the top of the dial is key for figuring out the rest of like a VOR question. So you would kind of start there with what number is going to be at the top. Sometimes you'll also hear it referred to as the OBS setting. So if you have a number at the top that you don't want, you would turn the OBS knob, and this whole card all the way around with all these bearings 360 degrees, that would turn as you turn the OBS so that a new number would be at the top. Multi-engine instrument rating and fail it all, and then do an approach with a VOR, and yeah. Yeah, so set blank on the OBS, right? So they would say, set 360 on the OBS. They're talking about this up here. So you would turn the OBS knob. I'm going to get a laser pointer here. You turn the OBS knob until the number that you want is at the top. And then here we have the CDI needle. That's an important part of getting the reading out of the VOR. So that's going to tell you kind of left and right of your intended radial, and we'll get into that. These markings over here tell us how much left and right. So you see it mentions here it's about 2 degrees. So we'll also get into that, how you could read into those. And then this here is the to from indicator, and it tells us some more information about our position. We'll cover that, of course. So lots going on the indicator, and this is one to definitely know is what does the needle mean? What does the flag mean? What do I do with the knob? And that'll be kind of fundamental here. Okay, and hang on, gotta get rid of my laser. Hang on. Okay, so to start, we're going to talk about going kind of directly to the VOR, and then at the end we'll talk about some of the trickier test questions, which is, hey, I have this number on the top on the OBS setting, and this is the indication, and where's the airplane, and it maybe gives you a list of different possible positions or something like that. That's when it gets really complicated. But first off, think about you're in the airplane. You are lost. It's maybe a little lower visibility or something like that. And you want to just fly to Wyerton. You think, okay, I don't know where I am, but I know that this airplane has a VOR. I want to get to Wyerton. I know that I can land in Wyerton. I just want to get there. The first step is making sure that you're actually tuned to the Wyerton VOR, because if you're not tuned and confirmed and identified that you're connected to the Wyerton VOR, you might be going off to some other completely different direction. So how do you do that? Well, you look at the map. So here's Wyerton, and there's two kind of darkish blue lines coming out of Wyerton. One that kind of comes out to the north like this, and then one that comes out to the east like this on the latest map. So when you follow this one out, it comes to the box. And in the box, it says VOR DME. That sounds like what we want. We want a VOR. Missile lock. Yeah, so we want to tune to the Wyerton VOR, so that's right. And it tells you the frequency of the Wyerton VOR, 117.7, and the identification of the Wyerton VOR is YVV. In the airplane, you don't have to know it's YVV. What you would do is look at this Morse code box here, and it's going to talk to you. It's going to give you that Morse code. So in the case of Wyerton, it would sound like da 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 da. And so you hear that through your through the headset when you tune and identify the VOR, and you know I'm going to the right VOR. Very important part of it. Okay, so now's the time if you have a second device available. So I have my phone here. I'll show you on. Pull out your second device, either a phone or a tablet that can get on the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. And let's take a look at what we're doing here. Some of you may have already done part of this process, but we'll just take a look. Okay, so I got my my phone on the App Store, and I'm going to search for Nav Aid Lite. And if you don't have your device handy, that's okay. You can still follow along. I'll have lots of stuff on the screen, but write that name of that app down, because it'll be really handy for you to come in and practice these different scenarios later. So Nav Aid Lite, it's this one that comes up. It's kind of got a logo with kind of a VOR on it. So very appropriate. Okay, so I'm going to install that. I'll let that go. Oh, yeah. It's a lot easier to be 0.1 off the right frequency and be close enough. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's just a lot more down there, right? Okay, so my app is downloaded. So I'm going to open that bad boy up. And here we are. So this app is going to let us kind of see a lot of the practical of I put the airplane here. I have the OBS set to this. What's the reading going to be, and that sort of thing. So the first things first, like I was saying, imagine that you're lost and you want to try and find the Wyerton VOR. So on the bottom down here, we've got the VOR is somewhere up. Looks to be to the northwest of us somewhere, but we don't know that because we're trying to figure that out. So we have we've already come to our map, and we've tuned and identified the VOR. So we know that we have the right one in the radio. It's working all right. You know, we turn the knob and the needle does something. So we know that that it seems to be working. So then the next step is going to be to just start turning the knob. And as I start turning it, what you'll notice is at some point the needle's going to center. Now, how I've centered it there, you can see it says from, and in this case it has the words to or from. You could have that, or it could have just an arrow pointing down. That would be the same thing, the from arrow. So I don't want that, because this setting would take me from, it would take me away. I don't want that. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to flip it around until the needle centers again. And there we go. So it's telling me 300 degrees, 300, is the heading to fly, basically. So this, again, is known as like a direct to the VOR. The needle centering, what that's really told us is what line, what radial are we on from the Wyerton VOR. So let me kind of draw out what I mean. So we have our VOR here, and we have our airplane over here. And as we're turning that OBS dial, the line in space that the VOR indicator is reading is changing. So it started where our line was perfectly north-south from the VOR, like that. And when the, oh, not loading, there we go. Having art problems, stand by. There we go. So our line, when I first loaded the app, was north-south, and I turn the dial until the needle in the cockpit lined up. That just so happens to be 300 degrees this way, or the reciprocal of that down at the bottom of the gauge is 120 degrees. So 120 degrees is kind of my bearing from the VOR. That's why when I had 120 degrees tuned at the top, it also centered the needle, but it said from. So if I flew 120 degrees, I would fly away from the VOR. If I flew 300 degrees, I would fly to the VOR. We can look at that again just to confirm. So we have 300 degrees at the top with a 2 indication. And then 120 degrees with a from indication. One more note before we fly our airplane away. I want you to notice that all of these indications we've seen so far, the airplane hasn't moved and the airplane hasn't changed direction. The airplane's facing north and it's been facing north the whole time. That's really important because nothing about this gauge, this VOR system, none of it depends on aircraft heading. It's all based on the actual position of the airplane. So people get themselves into lots of trouble because they mix up to and from or something like that. They get flying the wrong direction. And then maybe, or maybe the needle was centered, but because the gauge was upside down, the indication might tell you something misleading or something like that. Okay, so I'm gonna flip it around to 300 degrees because that would be what we want. So we want to fly direct to the VOR. And how would we do that? Well, we have 300 degrees is at the top, so that's our setting. So we read that off the gauge and we now turn the heading of the airplane. So we turn the heading of the airplane, the heading indicator would now say 300 degrees and fly. So let's say as we fly, we start to see a little bit of an error like that. So what's happened here? Well, it could have been us not flying a good enough heading. Maybe we're bad pilots and we can't maintain a heading. But more likely, it's probably the wind, right? The wind's gonna drift you off. How to fix that? Well, that's easy. If your goal is just to get there, I'm just gonna turn the dial and recenter it. You'll notice when I went this way, it got worse, so I went the other way. And there we go. There's our new heading to fly, 310 degrees. So I turn the nose of the airplane, fly the new heading. Maybe I even drift off a little bit again, but then I can just keep retweaking it, keep retweaking the heading on the airplane. No big deal. And we'll eventually get there. Okay, let's play around with some other scenarios just to solidify that. So let's say that we're not in that position. Let me just erase some stuff. Not let me erase. There we go. There we go. Technical difficulty. Okay, let's start out. Okay, so I got my VOR. And let's say my airplane is over here. I don't know that, of course, but for the sake of the argument. In this case, the airplane is to the northeast of the VOR. But like Dave's typing in the chat there, we don't actually have to even know that to run this procedure. So first things first, I'm going to turn the OBS dial until the needle centers. Something like that. So I centered the needle, and in this case, we do have a 2 indication. on the VOR, so that's good. And then, like Dave's saying, the number on the top, that's the heading to fly. So it looks like it's about 225 degrees. So I can turn to that. And on the app, if you're playing around on the app, it doesn't give you a readout of the exact heading, but that's fine. You can imagine kind of the circle around the VOR is similar to like a heading indicator. So I turn the airplane to 225 degrees and fly. Same thing, you know, maybe we get drifted off by the wind, something like this, as we're flying, and the needle goes off center. No big deal. We'll just center up the needle. We basically just run the procedure again, right? So we turn it until needle center with a 2 indication, and it is now. Fly heading 210, it says. So we'll turn the airplane a little more left to 210, keep on flying. Another thing about flying these sorts of tracks to the VOR is obviously you're noticing the needle is moving, right? Based on our position and based on an error from our position. We're not flying the same exact line that we were on previously. If you get to a point where the needle is a little bit left, a little bit right, you could fly back to the needle. Where people get into trouble with that is, say the needle goes off to the right. So we've got this tune, we've got this setup, we've got north at the top, our airplane's flying north, and it starts drifting off. The needle drifted off to the right. Well, we would turn to the right to correct for this. Watch what sometimes people will do when they're really far away from the VOR. So they start turning right, and the needle doesn't move, so they keep turning right. And they turn all the way around, or even if they don't turn all the way around, maybe they just end up on a heading like this. That's not going to help you get to the VOR. So it's really important to visualize kind of what's going on here, and for the IFR pilots that are going to do lots of this, they use a technique that they call bracketing, which is keep your heading close to north. You know that you want to go north, so your heading shouldn't be much off of north if that's where you're going. So in this case, if the needle drifted off to the right, you just make a little correction, right? And then that should recenter the needle, and then maybe go back to the previous heading or thereabouts, right? So that's kind of like tracking these radials to stay centered on them as you're approaching, you're flying to the VOR. Okay, so type in the chat. What do you think is going to happen on this route? We're south of the VOR. We've got north tuned. We've got the needle centered. We're flying north. What happens when we pass the VOR? We pass overhead. Bracketing is how Dave plays golf. Left side of the fairway, right side of the fairway. Yeah, there you go. So take your guesses. We pass the VOR on a heading north. Oh, hello. And remember, the line that we're thinking about is like this. It's this this north-south line, because we got north selected at the top here, and we're flying our airplane on the line. We're pretty good pilots, and so we're keeping it pretty good right on the line. So as we're approaching the VOR, that needle's still staying centered, and the indicator's still giving us a 2 indication. Well, at some point when we do that, and if you are playing around with the app, you can very quickly see as we get closer, it gets real hard to keep that line centered, but you can still do it. And then at some point, we fly past the VOR, line still centered. Line hasn't changed. The CDI needle I'm referring to, that hasn't changed. But it doesn't say to indication anymore. It's saying from. So now we're going from the VOR. That makes a lot of sense in this scenario. We're going from the VOR because a northerly heading would keep us getting further away, right? So that's the other scenario is you could go directly to a VOR, but you could also go directly from a VOR, right? So let's say a scenario of you just took off out of Wyerton, let's say, and you identified yourself over some landmark, and you know, okay, I'm perfectly en route, but maybe the next 10 miles on my route, there's not great landmarks over there. I want to stay on this same line that I'm on. I know it's a good line. I measured it on my map, and I see that this is right where I want to be. But for whatever reason, you know, I can't really navigate too well coming up because there's not great landmarks up ahead. So in that scenario, you might want to go directly from the VOR. It's the same process. So let's say I'm over here. This is kind of the line that I'm flying away from say I took off in Wyerton, and I'm flying out this way. And I want to keep flying that direction. I don't want to let the wind drift me and stuff like that. Well, same process. I could just start turning around. Hey, look, there's the needle center with a 2 indication. That's great if I want to fly to the VOR. Needle coming in the center there with a from indication. That would take me directly away from the VOR. This is not really a one that would come up on a test question or anything like that. Over Georgian Bay, yeah, don't do that from Wyerton. Yeah, that's not a good plan. So this one isn't so much a common test question, but maybe there's a couple VORs around you, and it's information that might be useful in some scenarios. Okay, so that's kind of direct 2. Let's run one more scenario just to make sure. Okay, so in this case, we don't know where our airplane is, but what we know is on our VOR indicator, we had 240 at the top, and so that's the OBS setting, and the needle is centered with a 2 indication. So what does that mean? Well, that means if I fly a heading of 240 degrees, it's going to take me directly to the VOR. Sometimes questions like this people can get mixed up and end up answering the wrong answer, even though they knew the process, right? You know the process is turn the OBS until the needle centers and you get a 2 indication, and then fly that heading on the top, you'll get directly to the VOR. So if you know that process in the real airplane, if you see this, you wouldn't get lost, right? You know how to fly to the VOR. But sometimes a question like this can be a gotcha because you're not in an airplane flying 240 to get to it. You're trying to visualize where is my airplane. What I like to do with these ones is don't overcomplicate it, and don't get your protractor out and measure to the degree. I like to think about it in the sense of kind of north, south, east, and west, right? And so I don't have this isn't set up for the scenario, but even before so let's just pretend for a moment that OBS indicator is actually just your heading indicator. You're not flying 240 yet, but you're just kind of flying where you're going, and you can read around these gauges and get an idea of kind of the cardinal directions, right? So 240 it's telling us where to fly. West is just to the right of that. So 240 is almost west, but it's kind of southwest. So you can see that 240 is between south and west. So then we come back to our note paper that we got during the test, and we know that if we keep going clockwise around from 240, we're going to have west is over here, and then south is over here. And then that means that north must be over here, and then east is over here. So to get to the VOR, we're flying southwest. So which direction is that? Southwest is this way. That means we must be on this side of it to get there, right? So let's confirm all this. So first thing, I'm going to take my OBS, and I'm going to put 240. 240 on the top. And I'm going to put my airplane to the northeast of the VOR. And here we go. We have the needle centered, 240s at the top, and we have a 2 indication. So all that's great. But again, notice that the airplane's not flying west. The airplane's, it's not flying southwest. It's flying northeast. So again, remember that the heading of the airplane does not have an effect on whether or not the indication is going to give you what you want. A lot of your test questions for the written test really capitalize on this and almost, well, they do kind of trick you in a lot of ways. You'll often get a map like this on a written test, indicating like, hey, the VOR is right in the middle, and which airplane are you when you have such and such instrument indication. And the trick is these two airplanes would likely, in most scenarios, have the same instrument indication because they're very close, but they're pointed opposite directions. So if you get your brain mixed up and look at where they're pointed, you're going to end up coming up short, right? So that's a very common kind of trick question on the written exam, is you get two airplanes pointed very similar or pointed different directions in a similar position, and the trick is that you might visualize left or right of this airplane, left or right of this airplane, and get something backward. So it's really, really important. I'll say it again, especially as we get into the upcoming scenarios here. Doesn't matter where the airplane's pointed. Maybe you kind of pretend the airplane's pointed one way or another to help you visualize and confirm, but the airplane direction does not matter at all. Very, very important. Okay. So these are all kind of like our direct to scenarios. So we have the needle center, to from indication, and that's going to take us directly to or directly from if we fly that heading. So next I want to get into the more tricky ones, which is mostly based on that map, which is how do I, with some obscure indication that doesn't have needle centered, how do I figure out where the airplane is? There's kind of, well, there is two different parts of that, and we already learned one of those parts, which is the to from indication, but you might not realize you've learned it. So let me bring us back to just the plain old north-south VOR indication. So we have the radial. I'm going to put in red here. So if the airplane was on this line somewhere and the VOR indicator, say I had 360 at the top on the OBS, so we're on that line somewhere, it's going to mean that the needle is centered because we're on that line, we're on that radial somewhere. What tells us if it's going to be to or from? Think about that. So if the indication says to, well, that's saying flying 360 is going to take you to the VOR. Notice that, like I was saying before, it might say the word to, but a lot of them have an arrow. A lot of them have an arrow that points up or points down. That arrow is pointing. You can kind of think of it as like the arrow's not over here, but maybe the arrow is here. That arrow is pointing to the OBS indication, the 360. So if that arrow, that to arrow, is saying 360, well, that means flying 360 would take you to the VOR. If it said from, well, then it's saying flying 360 would take you from the VOR further away. So the arrow is telling us whether we're, in this scenario, north or south of this line. right? So if my airplane was down here, I'm flying to the north, and I have 360 at the top, and I'm heading 360. All of this is going to take me to the VOR, right? Now, what if I was pointed the opposite direction? Or let me make that a little more clear. Say the needle's still close enough to center, but I'm pointed the opposite direction. It's still a 2 indication, because again, remember the heading hasn't changed it, but it could help you to visualize it, right? So if you think, okay, pretend I'm always flying the heading at the top or something like that, whatever you got to do to visualize it, but know that the actual aircraft heading doesn't matter. Okay, so that makes sense. If we had a from indication, therefore, that means that we are north of that line, and flying further 360 would take you from the VOR. Another way to look at this as well is the arrow is kind of pointing the cardinal direction for where the VOR beacon is, right? So the arrow pointing to the north means that the beacon is more north of you. The arrow pointing to the south means the beacon is more south of you. So that to from flag is also valid even if that needle's not centered. And I'll show you some scenarios here. So ignoring the needle entirely for a second, if my airplane was over here, we still have the same 360 at the top, we're still going to get a from indication. At the bottom of my indicator, it would say 180. The arrow is pointing to 180, so the indicator is telling me, hey, that VOR is to the south of you, right? It's not due south, but it's somewhere south of us, right? If we fly further south, we would get closer towards this this line, which is kind of like the to from line where the that's kind of where the VOR is as far as that to from flag is concerned. It doesn't know the too much about the whether we're left or right in this case. It really just knows this kind of north and south scenario. So that's the to from flag. Let's look at some other scenarios, because I know that this one can be quite a tricky one. So let's say that we're on some more obscure angle. So we got our VOR. And let's say that we tune 330. 330 when I cheat and then look at my my dial here, 330 is between north and west. Hey Jillian, how's it going? Yeah, the HSI is it's a little different to get on board with it, but yeah, it can avoid some of the confusion where you get your head on upside down and or pointed backwards sometimes. So let's say I have 330 at the top of my OBS. That is between north and west. So my radial, my line coming out of the VOR, whoops, taking screenshots. My line coming out of the VOR is going to be northwesterly, right? So something like this. I will center it on the VOR. I will try a third time. I'm doing great. Okay, so my line is 330. It's going northwest, and in this case, not quite 330. It's a little bit less. Shh, I won't tell anyone. Don't worry too much about. Again, don't pull your protractor out on the test. You don't need that much accuracy. It's close enough. So 330. That's the radial I've selected. Again, I'm not even going to worry about the CDI needle, but just thinking about the to from indication. Let's say my VOR indicator gives me a 2 indication. In this case, 2 indication, that's telling me that if I was to fly 330, because think of this as kind of like pointing at 330. If I was to fly 330, I would get closer to the VOR. Or more specifically, I'll get closer to this kind of to from line, which is 90 degrees off of my my radial. Yeah, for sure, reverse sensing. We'll do normal sensing and then we'll get reverse sensing for sure. Yeah, so if I have 330 on the top, it's saying flying that heading, if I flew 330, I would get closer to this VOR, or closer to that to from line. So in this scenario, that means I'm somewhere over here. Maybe I'm over here. Maybe I'm over here. Maybe the needle's even centered and I'm right here. But all of this is a to indication. Fly that way to get to the VOR. The opposite is true with a from indication. I had a from indication here. Otherwise, it might literally say from, or just a down arrow from indication. That's saying if I flew more 330, I would get further from the VOR. So in this case, something like this. Could be in any of these positions and have a from indication, because I would get further away from that to from line as I flew. So that's the to from indication, and remember that the to from doesn't care in this case if we're on the radial, if we're left or right of the radial. It doesn't actually know about that. All it knows is this secondary line that is kind of connected to our radial, 90 degrees. I don't internalize that secondary line as much as just thinking, in this scenario, if I flew 330, I'm getting further away, right? That's just what it is. If in the other scenario, in the to scenario, when we're on our side, the side I'm on, if I flew 330, I would get closer to the VOR. So that's kind of the way to that's the way to think about it. Is the arrow is kind of indicating flying that heading on the top. Are you going to get closer to or further away? Okay, let's reset. So let's talk about the CDI needle now. So we know that if we're on this red line, needle's center, right? So we got 330 at the top. If we're anywhere on this red line, doesn't matter where we are, because that's my 330 degree radial, that needle's going to be right on center. So I could be here, I could be here, I could be even potentially over top of the VOR, I could be, way over here. Anywhere that's lined up with that line, needle's going to be center. Where it gets tricky is if you're on not on the line, and how to visualize that. I just kind of gave an aid to the visualization in that all my airplanes were pointed that way. But again, doesn't matter where the airplane's pointed. The VOR does not care where the airplane's pointed. All it cares is what's on the OBS and what's the position of the airplane. So for the needle questions, for as we go forward, it's helpful to not even think about where my airplane is kind of oriented, but just think of the airplane as like an X or a dot. It's like there's X marks the spot. There's my airplane. Who knows where it's pointed? Because it doesn't affect how you answer the question. So let's say my airplane is over here. Think about that. We got 330 on the OBS. What's the indication going to be? As you're studying this, if it's been a while or it's new to you, you might go, I don't know. And this is where, pull out your mobile device. If you don't have one handy, pull it out, later when you're looking back at the video. And for anyone joining in, the name of the app that I'm using, again, the name of the app is Nav Aid Lite on Google Play or the Apple the App Store. So it's very beneficial to, if you're studying this and you're like, I don't know, like what is it? Pull out the app. When I learned VOR stuff, I didn't learn it out of the book. I learned it by doing this kind of stuff, you know, in flight simulators, actually, not with dedicated simulators for this. If you got a flight sim set up at home, that's great. Use the flight sim too. But this is great for this kind of stuff. So if you're stewing and you're thinking, I don't know where the needle's going to go, run it through the app. If you're not watching this live, pause it, get the app out, run through it, and see. So here we are. We're to the south of the station, basically. We're kind of southwest of that radial, though, and that's the way I want you to think about it. Don't think about where you are based on the station. Think about it. I'm pointing at the screen, but you can't see where I'm pointing. Sorry. Yeah, don't think about where we are based on the station. Think about where we are based on that radial. So we're kind of southwest of the radial here, but south of the station. But the south of the station part doesn't matter, because the needle would say the same thing if we were there or if we're here. To from might be different, but the needle would still say the same thing if we're over here or over here. The needle indication on all these points is exactly the same. So don't worry about where you are from the station, the VOR beacon, but think about where are you compared to that line, that red, in this case, radial line. So in this case, if I took a line from kind of the closest point and I drew it to my airplane, whoa, hello. Took a line from the closest point, drew it to my airplane. That line is going southwest. We can simplify the indication on our OBS dial up here. This direction that we've selected is northwest. If we keep going around the dial and filling in kind of the cardinal directions, 90 degrees off of northwest would be northeast. 90 degrees off of northeast would be southeast. 90 degrees off of southeast is going to be southwest. Don't get this wrong. And then 90 degrees off of southwest is going to be northwest. I like to think about it like this. I don't actually use the numbers when I'm writing test questions because I will mess it up. So simplify it. Think about north, south, east, west, or northeast, southeast, whatever. So now that I've drawn that on, say, my note paper, you get a little note paper on the written test. You can fill all this stuff in. So now that I've drawn out the cardinal directions, this is starting to build a big picture. Remember, I was saying this line is going to the southwest, and hey, look at that. Southwest is one of the things that I wrote on my VOR CDI indicator. So if you're wondering which way the needle's deflected, well, that's pretty good evidence that the needle in this case is going to deflect. I did that wrong. The needle is going to deflect to the right, oddly enough. The reason being, what I did wrong that was confusing is think of the needle same as the arrow. It's the direction that you would fly to get to that radial. I got that upside down. Sorry about that. The way to think about the needle is kind of the radial in a way. So what that's saying is that radial is northeast of me, right? So I got it upside down in that if the needle was a picture of an airplane, then it would be the other way, but it's not. So that radial is northeast of me, and that's how you can solve for that. So here's the thing: I just goofed up and I made a mistake. How did I catch it? Because that's really what matters. You can make all the mistakes you want as long as you catch them. And how I caught it was, I start with this technique, which I did upside down, and that was silly of me. But then after I do that technique, I confirmed it with another method. So to run through what the technique is here again is, the radial is to the northeast of my position. And so because of that, the needle is deflected to the northeast. The needle is deflected to the right. If I got that backwards, like I just did, because you can see how easy that is, right? And if you're writing a test and you just go, oh, southwest, bam, like answer done, and then you get the question wrong, and this is why this is so tricky, right? It's very tricky to not mix up. The way I figured it out was confirming with visualization, right? So then after I figure out what the right or what I think the right answer is, then I ignore the crazy picture on the test that's going to confuse you and get you upside down backwards. But I visualize and write on my own little note paper, okay, if I was flying a heading of 330, which side is the radial on, right? The radial is on the right side in this case, so a right needle deflection. But it's important to note that, again, even if the airplane was pointed the other way, it would still have the same indication. So this is purely a visualization, for confirming. But that's a way that you can catch it. That's how I just got it, right? Is visualizing if I was flying 330, where would the radial be compared to me, right? Okay, I will clean this up a little bit. So 330 radial. And then again, in this case, we have needle deflected to the right because the radial is to the northeast of us. What does the to from flag say for this scenario? I'll draw in our kind of secondary line, or to from line, 90 degrees off. Tyler's got it first. 2. Why? No, so it's going to say 2 in this case, because if we were to fly 330, we would get closer to the VOR, right? So we fly 330. We're going to get closer to this to from line. We're getting ever so close, so slightly closer to the VOR. It might be hard to see that, but we're getting closer to this this line. This point would be, like, as we fly by, that would be the closest we get, and then we get further away as we keep on going. So when we pass this line, the needle would continue to say left, but the flag would flip to from, because flying 330 would, the needle would continue to stay right. Oh my gosh, needle would stay right, and then flag would flip to from as we go by. Cool. You can see why this is one of the trickiest test question ones, because it's so easy to get your head on upside down and backwards and inside out. And so lots of just kind of confirm as much as you can for these ones, for sure. Okay, so we got our VOR. And let's say that we have 150 at the top. That's our OBS setting there. And so again, before we even go further, what I would do is simplify, because 150 is one of these oddball numbers, right? So it can be helpful to go, okay, well, 150, that's between south and east, right? So 150 is southeast. I would just write that in there, right? So we got southeast. As we continue around our OBS dial, we're going southeast, and then we're going to be going southwest 90 degrees later. And we keep on going. We're going to be going northwest 9 degrees later. Keep on going. And then we're going to be going northeast. And then back to southeast. So now we know we've established some some simplified directions here. We don't have to even worry about 150 anymore. We have the basic numbers. We know that the radial we're talking about goes northwest to southeast. So northwest in this scenario is in the upper left corner, and then southeast in the bottom right. I'll draw my line better. There we go. So hey, look at that. Very similar to what we just had for a scenario. So the radial, I will just put it in here so I don't forget. It was 150, and let's say that on the test they give you a left needle with a 2 indication. And so then you have to figure out where the airplane is. You're really lost in the compass heading. Dial until the CDI is centered. You can fly into the station. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we. So for anyone that's just tuning in, all this is going to be on the what am I saying? It's all recorded, and as soon as this is done, you can go back and watch. So we started talking about Direct 2 and some of the basics about how the system works. So for anyone that missed that, feel free to go back and watch that when we're done. Nice. Yeah, and it is a lot easier in the plane. And so Tyler brought up, a good point that, like I was saying, I learned doing this kind of stuff. I learned by just taking my airplane on my iPad and going woo, and just moving it around, or more specifically in my case, getting in the flight sim. If you're in flight training or have an airplane or something like that, playing around with it in the airplane, I find is way easier to learn this stuff than just staring at a paper. So for sure that this is why follow along with the app. Do it on the device. So for those of you that have the app loaded, I'm sure you probably figured this one out already. So if we have 150 on the top, the needle left, and a 2 indication. So if I'm promoting the app, I may as well come back to the app. So I'm gonna just do that. 150 at the top. Okay. And where the airplane is now clearly isn't it, so I'm just gonna orbit the airplane around the VOR until I get the right information. This seems pretty good. Somewhere over here. 150 at the top. Needle left 2 indication. So it's somewhere up over here. Now where the downfall of this is, it's kind of hard to see where the lines are. You kind of have to trial and error it a little bit and get a feel for it. But it seems kind of west-ish is where I get that indication. So let's come back to the note paper and break it down a little bit. So it's hard to kind of tell when you're in this sense, because we're not on the radio. We're just close, or we're in kind of a quadrant. But I kind of got the feel that when I had the airplane over here somewhere, it seemed to be working. It seemed to be that indication. Let's break it down into the 2 different sections. So first off, needle to the left. So when the needle is to the left, that means that hey, the station is more northeast of, or sorry, the radial is more northeast of the airplane. So if my airplane was in this kind of region that I drew, that makes sense. The radial is more northeast of me. I'm gonna make the radial red because I had it like that before. Confusing. Yeah, so there's my red radial there. But playing around in the app, I'm still not sure that I was necessarily in this quadrant. I just kind of got the feel maybe we're in this quadrant, but I couldn't rule out that maybe we're not right here or something like that. So let's confirm. The to from indication is saying, hey, that VOR, that's this way. The VOR is southeast of us, right? Or put another way, if we did fly southeast, we would get closer to the VOR. So that makes sense. If I fly southeast, I'm going to get closer to this this VOR kind of to from line, and closer to the VOR as well. And so that totally makes sense. So that's definitely nailed it. Like we know that we're in that that quadrant there. That's kind of west of the VOR. Yeah, Julian, this is what I was saying, is like, it's so easy to get your head on backwards. It's so easy to look at it, and especially let me put this another way. Let's say in this question, this is what the test question gives you. This is what Transport Canada gives you. And let's say all the airplanes on the page just so happen to be pointed this way. And that may even be where someone could get this backwards, just because if you're looking at the page, you're looking at a north up view of the page, right? So it seems like, okay, radial to the left, right? But if all the airplanes, in this case, if all the airplanes are pointed north, it changes your perception on kind of what you're looking at. So it's helpful, I find, to start with the dial like this. Start with southeast, southwest, northwest, northeast, and then that will keep you from getting upside down. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Julian, that's a great point. That's classic reverse sensing. So what he means by reverse sensing is, if you get the airplane pointed the opposite direction versus what is in the OBS setting, the needle goes the opposite direction of what you're expecting it to. Because again, the needle doesn't care where the airplane's pointed. The needle just knows the setting that you have, the 150 in this case, and it knows the aircraft's position. And so the possibility of pointing the airplane the wrong heading is very easy. So like I say, on a test question like this, if they gave you all your airplanes were all scattered around, pointed the wrong way, so easy to get mixed up there. So the way I have the two methods that I use. The first one is based on the OBS. I ignore all these airplanes. I wouldn't even look at them to start. I would draw all this out on my little note paper, right? Because when you look at the test question taints what you're thinking. You're looking at this diagram and you're like, oh no, what is it, right? Don't look at this diagram. You're not ready for it yet. They told you 150, and they told you left needle, 2 indication, right? So you have all that info. You draw it all out on your page like this, on your note paper, and then you start looking at it and you go, okay, that radial is more northeast of me because of the needle, and the VOR is more southeast of me because of the to from flag. And then you can start building in that picture of, here's my to from line, 90 degrees off, and where's my radial. If my radial's northeast of me, that means I'm somewhere on this side of the VOR, and the to from flag means it's saying 2, so that's saying VOR is more southeast of me, so that means I'm somewhere on this side. So where those two line up is that I have to be in this quadrant, right? Radial is more northeast of me, and then to from, well, if I go 150, we'll get closer to. And then I would, like I say, I'll use the second method. So this is the first method. Draw it out, get the your compass set up with, or the OBS set up with the cardinal directions. And then the secondary method that I like to do is pretend I am flying 150. And again, 150 is southeast. So my airplane's in that quadrant, flying southeast. And what would that look like? Well, the radial just so happens to be out my left wing. So that's good. And if I keep flying this direction, I would get closer to the VOR, closer to that to from line. So that confirms what I determined using this method up here. Yeah, and I do a lot of detail on my note paper every time I write a test, because it keeps you from getting upside down. So like, think about performance ground school. Like you're going to do a takeoff and landing distance calculation, right? And let's say you're going to do a takeoff and there's wind and there's some crosswind and there's a higher than normal density altitude, and oh, by the way, you're also on grass. And when you go through that formula, you have to go through each of those items, and each of those is a stage that you can make a mistake. So the way that I handle that is each time I figure something out, I calculate something, I visualize something, it ends up down on the page so that I can come back to that and go, okay, what did I do here? What is 350.4 secs? You know, you need to kind of have a name on that thing, you know, for what it's representing for you for that question. Okay, so that I think we cover. Anyway, yeah, we definitely covered the. Here's an indication. Tell me where the airplane is. Let's do another one. Here's where the airplane is. Tell me what the indication is going to say. So I'll reset. So that, by the way, is kind of the two different scenarios. One, they could, and very likely they'll use a map like this. Not all the time, but very likely. And what they tend to do is have two different types of questions. One, they will say, which of these airplanes has this instrument indication? Right? The other way that they could interpret that is the aircraft is positioned at position F. This is the OBS setting. What does the indication say? So kind of backwards to what we just did, right? So if you're given an indication, figuring out where the airplane is, versus you know where the airplane is, what is the indication? So they could ask you either scenario here. So let's do one like that. So we have our VOR. And let's use that example. We got an airplane at position F, and we want to know the indication. So let's say we have an OBS, which is set at, let's do 060. Oh, hello. Actually, I don't like that angle. Let's do 120. OBS is set to 120. And we want to know what the indicator is going to say. We're at position F there. So if you're a cheater, you could get a head start and start playing around with the iPad there. I'm going to start by getting my cardinal directions sorted out first off. So 120. When we cheat and look at the heading indicator, we'll see 120 right here. That's between east and south. So 120 is a southeast heading. Okay, and we keep going around. 90 degrees after southeast, we're going to get southwest. 90 degrees later, we're going to have northwest. And then we're going to have northeast. Right? So we got the cardinal directions out there. And then I'm also going to draw the radial, because without the radial on the page, we're kind of in trouble. So 120 again is southeast. And if you wanted to be a little more detailed than I have been, if you happen to have a compass in front of you, you can see it's a little bit more east than it is south. But you don't even need that much. But I will attempt to recreate a 120 heading that goes through the VOR. Oh my gosh, that goes through the VOR. Okay, so there's my 120, and so we're already starting to get some information on the page there. Okay, so in this case, 120. Again, forget about where the airplane's pointed. In this case, the airplane's almost pointed at 120, but that could easily confuse you. So when you transfer this from the PC test to your note paper, you're going to just put an X or a dot or something like that. So that's where my airplane is. let's start with the CDI indication, the needle indication. So if I was to fly from my present position towards the radial, what direction is that? So in this case, it's not quite south, it's a little to the west of south. So southwest we have on our OBS. So needle's going to be to the right in this case. And then the to from flag. So some of you, Tyler was getting ahead of me there. He's got some answers there, but I'll walk through it. So we have our to from line there, 90 degrees off the radial. And in this case, if we were to fly 120, so 120, the OBS setting at the top, if we were to fly that heading, we would get further from our to from line, or further from the station. So that tells me a from indication. Well, it's not on that side, but I didn't want to draw over my other stuff. So it's a from indication with a right deflection on the needle. So that was one method that I used to come up with both of those. I'm going to confirm using another method. So my method for the to from is, hey, look, that arrow also happens to be pointed south, pointed down on the gauge. So it's pointing to northwest. So what the arrow, the from flag, is telling me is, hey, the station is more northwest of us. And so if I was to fly northwest, then yes, that's where the station would be, right? So that's my method of confirming that. So the one method was visualizing, if I was to fly southeast, is that going to take me from? If I looked to the northwest, is the arrow pointing to where the station would be? So kind of the two different methods there. My method for confirming the needle on the left, the needle on the right of us, airplane on the left of the radial, my way of figuring that out is draw a little airplane. So instead of the X, again, doesn't matter where the airplane in the question was pointed, but if I was to fly 120, then yes, the radial would be off my right wing there. And so that makes sense. So the right deflection on the needle. Yeah, so that's kind of the two different scenarios. That's our that's kind of our tricky test questions and where they get you into trouble there. Yeah, so I think in terms of I'll talk a little more too on what Julian was mentioning, reverse sensing there, because like I say, that's in the real airplane. That's really where people are going to get into trouble is. They get the visualization, they get their head on upside down, and it's reverse sensing. And so if we take this exact same scenario, let's say you made a goofy mistake. Who would make a goofy mistake on a question like this? And you just happen to do the visualization technique first, but your airplane was pointed this way in your mind. You might go, hey, I know this. The radial, that's off my left wing. So the needle must be deflected to the left, right? So that's how you get this question wrong, is doing it based on the direction the airplane's pointed, basically, because that's depending on the heading there. So in the real airplane, where people get into trouble though is they're not writing a test question. What they're doing is reading the indicator on the airplane, and in this case, you could interpret this as saying turn to the right, right? Because the needle's to the right. You might think turn right, and in this case, if we turn right in an attempt to get to the needle, we want to get to our radial. A turn to the right is going to take us further away from our radial, and the radial again, of course, being this red line. So that's no good, and that's reverse sensing. And where that tends to come up in actual flying is not a scenario like this where we're like 60 degrees off the the radial or something like that. But maybe our airplane is right here. We're very, very close to the radial, but not quite on it. And so in that case, we're not going to have this extreme, like, peg to the maximum deflection needle indication. Maybe we just have a little error. You know, it's just a little to the right. In this sort of a scenario, the issue that I just described of, hey, the needle's a little bit to the right, I'm going to turn a little bit right, get back to the needle, that's going to cause us to get further away from our radial. And then as a result of that, we're going to make it worse, and we're going to end up pegging the needle to the right because we've gone the wrong way. There's some, when you get into the instrument procedures, the IFR stuff, there's some approaches that they do which are not really used very much at all anymore, but they call them localizer back course approaches, and they're literally this. It's literally that the equipment is only capable of displaying backwards, and when the needle says right, you got to go left, and when the needle says left, you got to go right. And there was so many accidents that happened because of it, even though pilots knew. And what do? They pull out their, it wasn't an iPad when these were more common, but they pull out their documentation, their approach plates, and they go, okay, we're going to do this back course approach. And all over it it's written, all over the page that they're reading, it's written, it's reverse sensing, it's backwards, don't mix it up, it's backwards. What do they do every time? They get off course. Because when you see a needle that goes to the right, and you're used to, okay, it goes to the right, that I want to chase that needle, so I'm going to turn to the right. It's so powerful, the psychology of that. So even when you're sitting on the ground at 0 knots and 1G, you can still be affected by that. And so if you visualize where your airplane is pointed when you haven't started with the kind of the cardinal directions part, you can easily get into that trap. In my case, I got into the trap with the cardinal direction method, and with looking at, and by that I mean like looking at the dial, looking at whether the needle is pointed to the left or to the right of the dial. It's helpful to have the second method to confirm and keep you out of trouble. Okay, let's do more scenarios. You never have too many of these VOR scenarios. Let's make it, I'll make it even more test question like. So you get this this chart on the test question, and it's saying you have 090 on the OBS, and the left needle indication, and yeah, so 090 left needle indication and a 2 flag. I'll start writing it down on my note paper. 090 left needle and 2 flag. Okay. This makes the cardinal directions a little bit easier. So we have east, south, west, north. That's nice. And so what the question's going to be asking about, 090 left indication 2 flag, it's going to basically say what's the indication for each of these airplanes, or which of these airplanes would have that indication, basically, right? So that's what this question would be, is which of these airplanes have that indication? 090 left CDI deflection and a 2 flag. So can I draw on this thing? I think yes. Okay, so 090, that's easy. Here's our radial here, and a left needle indication and a 2 flag. So thinking about the left needle indication, that means if I was to go more to that left side of the dial, if I was to go more north, I would get to the radial, I would get to the radial, right? So that's very important to recognize here. Don't look at, whether, or don't look at the, don't look at the direction the airplanes are pointed, because these two are pointed opposite directions. This one's pointed 90 degrees off this one. This is on some weird angle. So don't worry about those. But again, the needle left, I want to look at what airplanes, if I was to fly north, would I get closer to the radial? Because again, the needle is telling me where the radial is. This guy, if I flew north, I'll get to the radial. This guy, if I flew north, I would get to the radial. This guy, if I flew north, I'd get to the radial. This guy would be a centered needle because he's right on the radial. Same with this guy. And so therefore, this one, if I flew north, I wouldn't get to the radial. So that would be the opposite indication. Same thing with this guy and with this guy. So all of these would be the opposite indication there. So that's the first part, is that the airplanes that we're looking at are in the south quadrant. The next part is the 2 flag, right? So the 2 flag is pointing to 090. So for that, first method I'll talk about is this. If I draw in the 90 degree off line, to from line here, which airplanes? So again, in this case, I don't care about these ones up here because they're not relevant. They wouldn't have the line on the left side. Which airplanes, if they were to fly 090, which is our OBS setting, which of those airplanes would get closer to this this to from line here? And so in this case, Julian got it right. The airplane. Oh, I can't undo. These drawings are permanent, by the way. I just learned. Airplane A would get closer to the to from line if I was flying west. Same thing with airplane B, even though airplane B is pointed the opposite direction. That is so tricky if you're not, if that's not at the top of your mind. Airplane H, if he was to fly 090, would get further from the to from line, further from the station, and so he's not applicable there. And so again, we have, in this case, oh, I guess I left some stuff. West, north. Okay, so again, we eliminated all the other options. Basically, airplane A and B is the correct answer, and the confirmation. Because again, I keep saying confirmation. Let's look at this another way. So when I talked about the to from flag, I talked about, okay, if I flew more east, would that take me to the station? Basically, the other way I look at it is, imagine the to from flag is just an arrow pointing to the station, right? Is kind of the alternate way to look at it, and it's the same scenario. The arrow is pointing to the station, and so that makes total sense. The other method for the north-south, whether or not we have a left or a right deflection, for me, I visualize if the airplane was flying this radial, this selected radial that we have, 090, is at the top of our OBS. If we were flying that direction in this quadrant, which is where we think we are, if we were an airplane flying here, which wing would the radial be on, right? And in this case, the radial is on our left, right? And that makes sense because the needle's to the left. So that's kind of our confirmation. We've looked at it some different ways there. Confirmation of our confirmation, and again, this is how I think you should really make high use of the app. Use the app in your studying to confirm these things. So we'll recreate the scenario in the app again. So again, we have an OBS setting 090, and our hypothesis, our guess is that we're in the southwest quadrant, along with these guys. Airplane A and B are in the southwest here. That's our hunch. And so put the airplane southwest, we have a left needle indication and a 2 flag. So that's good. So that's our confirmation there. I think that's about it for scenarios. Maybe I'll run one more of those kinds of scenario, just because you can never have too many. But that's essentially it there. Okay, here's a good exercise for us. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna figure out how to clear out all of my drawings. There we go. Okay, so let's say in this scenario we have let's say that we have I'm trying to trick you. I'm trying to think of a tricky one. 060 at the top. Whoops. So 060 at the top. I want to figure out what each of the airplane's indications are going to be. Next training session, we'll probably do another. Next week. So I want to figure out each of these airplanes and what they're going to indicate. And so let's start with Mr. E over here. And no, Dave, I haven't done that yet. Getting into that. So airplane E here. Let's think about his indication. So for 060, I'm going to draw that radial in. Airplane E's got a mini OBS dial in his airplane, and if he was to fly from his position to that radial, that would be a cardinal direction of southeast. So in this case, let's start putting the cardinal directions in here again. So I have northeast, we have southeast, southwest, and then northwest. Okay, so if he was to fly to the southeast, he would get closer to the radial. So that would give him a right needle deflection. Oh, I put it on the wrong thing. He needs it on his airplane. In his airplane, he has a right needle deflection, and in this case, if we visualize the to from line here, if he was to fly 060 degrees, he would get further from the station. So he's going to have a from arrow. I'm drawing it on the wrong side, but I don't have a lot of room. Okay, so we got a right and from. I'll skip airplane F. Let's go to airplane G. So he's got his little OBS indicator. He would also be flying from the station if he was to fly 060 degrees. In this case, you might get confused because he's not pointed 060, and don't get your head on backwards. Don't mix it up. If he was to fly, in this case, to the northwest, heading of northwest would get him closer to the station, or sorry, closer to the radial that is selected. So that's for the needle. So that's going to give the left indication. So for airplane G, you're going to have a left and a from. Airplane H, he's got his own little OBS. He would also be flying to the northwest if he was to get to that radial. It also just happens to be to the VOR, but really for the needle, we just care about the radial. And I'll even test this one just to kind of show what I'm talking about. So 060 on the top. and airplane H is to the southwest of the station, right about there. So we have the left needle indication and off. What's off? What do you mean it's off? I turned it on. So this is an alternate flag, and this is what Dave's talking about in talking about the off. So what the off is referring to is airplane H is right on this imaginary to from line. Airplane H, if they were on a heading of 060 flying that direction, they're as close as they're ever going to be on that heading, right? If they were over here flying this way, they're getting closer, getting closer, getting closer, and then they get to their position where it says off. And then once they get past that position, they're going to be getting further away, and then they would have the from flag. So in this case, there's no flag. It might say the word off. It might just have a little red indicator. Or in the case of ones that don't have words and just have the arrows, there's no arrows visible. Would be that. Yeah, exactly. So and so some of the Tyler brings up a good point there too. In between to and from, some indicators, it is literally in between to and from, because a lot of the indicators. Let me see if I can find a good picture of what I'm talking about. A lot of the indicators actually have a little what am I saying? They actually have like a roller in them. What am I looking for? There's one. So this Garmin indicator here. That's right. No. There we go. This Garmin indicator. It has this little window in the top right corner there, and that window is actually your to from flag on this one. And so when it's 2, it'll say 2 in there, and then it'll roll to the off position, and then it'll roll again to the from position. So a lot of them have this kind of roller style to from flag like that. So that sort of scenario, that's what you're gonna get. Got too many things open. Okay, there we go. Cool. So let's keep going around. Let's keep going around to the other airplanes. D106A. Yeah, is that the one? It looks like the one we used to have in FWQ. I think it is. One of the Garmin Smart Indicators. So that being said, I'll actually come back to that, because I was saying at the beginning, like, hey, you might be in a scenario where maybe you're using a GPS, and the GPS you think, oh, I don't need to know this VOR stuff because I have a GPS. Well, all certified GPS systems have an indicator like this. It might be like this, or it might be a computerized one, but it should be displaying the same information. And the way that this works, the indication is the exact same thing that we're talking about. The number at the top, they might give you the number to put at the top. It'll be displayed on the screen somewhere. So the number at the top is going to be the kind of like the radio, kind of like the direction that you're intending to go. And then the needle, left and right, is going to tell you where your intended track is, left or right of the current position. It's exactly the same. It's not based on angles, it's based on distances. You will even, on a GPS system, which has an indicator like this, you will even get a to and from flag. It's exactly the same. And it's saying, hey, you're going to that next waypoint in your GPS flight plan, and so you're going to. And when you pass it, if the GPS wasn't to update for whatever reason, it would actually potentially flip to from in a lot of scenarios. So that's kind of cool. That's how it's related back to, even if you're never going to use a VOR, you should know how to at least see the indicator. Okay, let's continue here. We've got airplane F that I skipped because he's pretty close to the line. So airplane F here is going to be pretty similar to airplane E if he was to fly to the southeast in this case, which would be a right indication on our our indicator. Flying to the southeast would get him to the radial, but it's not a lot to the southeast. He's almost on the line, so it's probably not like a full deflection sort of thing. It's probably just a little bit. So it's not quite center, but just a. Okay, that's pretty close to center. I'm gonna redraw. Just a little bit to the right. It's a little right, but just not a whole lot. Something like that. So not full deflection. And just like airplane E, if he was to fly 060, which again is what's on our OBS, if he was to fly that, he would get further from the VOR. So he's going to have a from arrow there. Okay, what about airplane D? Take a think about that. Run it through your app. Draw a sketch. Take your guesses in the comments. What do you think about airplane D? What would his little OBS in the airplane tell him? So again, like all of them, he's got 060 at the top. Tyler says to right. Okay, and oh, to and right. There we go. Okay, so let's break it down. So just like airplane E, if airplane D was to fly to the southeast in this case, that would get him closer to the radial. And so that's giving us needle information there. So in this case, Tyler's correct. The needle's to the right. And he's pretty close to that 90-degree kind of to from dotted line here. But he's not right on it. So it wouldn't likely say off in this scenario. I think we would get an indication, because unless you're right on that line, it's going to give you an indication. So in this case, he's slightly to the southwest of that line, meaning if he was to fly more northeast this way, then he would get to that line. And so northeast, so if he was to fly the radial that we were flying, if he was to fly 060 degrees, then he would get closer to that line, and then that would get to flag. So yeah, Tyler's correct. To indication with a right needle. Okay, let's run that one actually, just for the sake of putting it in. So we still have 060 here. So here's the right indication. Here's where the off flag would be, but he's not quite right on that line. So he's just a touch to the south of that line like that. So he's somewhere like that, but he's pointing the other direction. Again, doesn't matter where the airplane's pointed, etc., etc. Yeah, very sensitive if you flew to the southeast to get the needle center. Yeah. The sensitivity, I think I just barely touched on this earlier, but playing around in the app gives you more of an intuitive sense for a lot of this stuff. Let's say I'm on this radial, this 060, and I'm flying to the VOR. When I'm back here, I can make fairly big changes, like miles of airspace taken up, and still not get full deflection on the needle. Like here's full deflection this way, here's full deflection this way. It's quite a large splay out over here. But then watch what happens when I'm pretty close to right over top. So there's full deflection there, there's full deflection there, and for those watching on phones, you might not even be able to see how much I'm moving the little airplane. It's a very minor movement, and so what the reason for that is it's based on angles. So the closer you get, the easier it is to affect the angle from the VOR. So again, remember the each dot out from the center on the indicator is 2 degrees. So in this case, I'm 2 degrees off of the radial. Now I'm 4 degrees off the radial, etc. That's a good point there too. Maybe this is a little more detailed than I need to get into, but a lot of the indicators like this one, your first 2 degrees is actually a circle, which is weird. So in this case, this part of the circle is 2 degrees left, 2 degrees right. By the way, there's a vertical line, there's a horizontal line. That is for the instrument landing system, not related to VOR stuff. So you can ignore the horizontal needle on this gauge. Okay. So then looking at other scenarios here too, with the to from flag going to off, you can see that's also based on the angle. So when you're very far away from the beacon, it might be off for a little bit. But when you're really close to the beacon, like when I'm right overhead, I'm going to have a hard time even making it say off. It more or less just goes to from. But when I'm way out over here, I can get it to stay off for just a little bit. So to off from, off to. So yeah, that sensitivity can be quite dramatically different. And coming back to how that affects you in the real airplane, if you're flying towards Wyerton, let's say, and you had, this 060 radial, say I wanted to fly towards Wyerton on this 060 line, when I'm 20 miles away, I can make a heading change and wait for 3 minutes before I see much of a correction. But when I'm 5 miles away, I make a heading change, the needle doesn't move for a little bit, and then all of a sudden it swings from one side of the scale all the way to the other, because it was outside of the scale of what the indicator could give me, and I'm just too close. And when you get really close, it's so sensitive. If you're 2 degrees right, how much should you correct to get centered again? That's a really good question, and the answer is it depends. But assuming that you were on track and now you're 2 degrees right, then that to me sounds like the classic navigation problem, which is solved by so this is more navigation theory than it is VOR theory, but it's solved by something called the double track error method. And so the question was 2 degrees right. So to me, I interpret 2 degrees right means my needle is deflected 2 degrees. So if my airplane is 2 degrees right, that means the needle is 2 degrees left. So that would put me drifting by the wind. My airplane is now here. So let's say I knew roughly, okay, it took me a minute to get off track by 2 degrees. Well, what that means is if I turn 2 degrees to the left, the wind is drifting me. I'm only going to parallel that track. That's not helpful. I don't want to parallel the track, so I'm going to double that. So I have a 2 degree error. I've identified that because the gauge told me 2 degrees off. I know I've flown for about a minute, I guessed, right? So I'm going to double that. So instead of turning 2 degrees, I'm going to turn 4 degrees. So I'll subtract 4 degrees from my heading, and then that would get me back on track. And I would see that. I would see that needle start to come in, and then once it comes back into center, I'll likely decide not to go back to the original heading that I had because I drifted off. And so in that case, maybe I would just add another 2 degrees worth of heading. This is kind of based on, the navigation sense. You may have a scenario where you never were on track. You're trying to get on track. So this part is still the same, right? Add, a couple degrees more than you think you need. Get back on track and then make a small change. The biggest thing with VOR navigation is don't overdo it, especially when you're really close to the VOR. If you're within 5 miles of the VOR, you don't want to point, in this case, 330 degrees and go 90 degrees flinging across the radial, because it's so sensitive. The gauge is going to just flip from one side of the scale to the other, and yeah. So that's stuff that it can be a lot to take in, and funny enough, in terms of the test questions, you're not likely to get asked questions about those kind of scenario-based things, even though in the real airplane, those are the sorts of things you care about. It may even, and I would say too, it kind of pushes a little bit into the IFR territory as well, because as a VFR pilot, you may just keep recentering that CDI dial and just keep the needle center. So it's like, okay, it's 2 degrees off, not anymore. So that's the technique that you may end up just running and not worry about it too much. So there's a complicated answer and then there's the easy answer. Just turn that OBS dial a little bit and you're not 2 degrees off anymore. Okay, we'll keep filling in the rest of our little buddies here. So we got airplane C. Airplane C as well, if he was to fly southeast, he would also get to the radial, so that would be a right indication on our gauge, so his needle's going to the right. If he was to fly the heading of 060, that would take him to our to from line, and so that's getting closer to the VOR, so he's going to have a 2 arrow there. Airplane B down here, if he was to fly to the northwest, that would get him closer to the radial, the northwest over here. So that's on the left side of his gauge if he's got 060 at the top, so a left indication. If he was to fly the heading of 060, that would take him closer to the station, closer to the to from line, so he's also going to have a 2 indication there. Airplane A to finish it off. It's exactly the same. He's in the same position, roughly speaking. He's just pointing the other way. So again, if he was to fly to the northwest, he would get closer to the radial, northwest on the left side of the gauge. And then if he was to fly 060, that would get him closer to the station, closer to the to from line. So it's a 2 indication. To put it another way, if we visualize both of these airplanes flying this direction, flying 060, the radial would be out the left wing. But the tricky part about those 2 airplanes for a question like this is, of course, they're pointed opposite directions. And if you visualize the right wing on airplane B here, you'll get it backwards. So definitely want to be careful on there. Cool. So that's that there. I think that's about all I got. How long have we been going for? We're going for, yeah, it's about 2 hours there. So cool. Well thank you guys for tuning in, and I want you stuck around for looks like the whole time, so that's great. Like I say, there's this is on the same link. There's going to be a video recording as soon as I hit stop here, so feel free to skim back through. And for anyone that has just caught the end of the live stream or is going to go back and watch the video, I'll scrub through the footage and put little timestamps down below in the description down below. There will be timestamps on the different topics. So again, we covered kind of some of the theory and the basics on how it works. And then we talked about direct to, and then we talked about kind of these different quadrants and how to figure out if you have an indication given or if you have a position given, and how to figure those different scenarios out. So that'll all be in the description down below with some timestamps for easy finding later. And other than that, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hey Quinn, coming in at the end. How's it going? Cool. We will see you probably next week, probably the same time next week. But we will put out some notifications on social media, sort of thing. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you on the flip side.